Okay, so I think that was pretty funny. I don't know if you guys enjoyed it or not, but I always show that when I before I teach some of my classes, I kind of show that kind of stuff because I think it's kind of easier to get into some of this if we just kind of laugh our way into it before we start to cry. Before we start to cry. So let's talk about Juneteenth. And as the introducer said, that I am Dr. Cynthia Robinson, and I am chair of the Department of Black Studies. Before that, I was in the School of Communication for 15 years. And so I like to tell people I teach everything between public speaking and slavery and race relations. And so that's me. So for today's presentation, we're going to talk about what led up to Juneteenth, what is Juneteenth, and why celebrate Juneteenth. You know, why is Juneteenth? Why should it even be important? There's a little bit of controversy about that, so we're going to talk about that. Juneteenth begins with slavery, as we just saw the little clip. 28 reasons to hug a black guy today. We don't really understand the magnitude of what slavery was, and this, if you guys can see, is a slave ship, and human beings packed into the bottom of this. We don't really understand the magnitude of what slavery was because we're not really taught about slavery. Um, and actually, we're getting further away from truly teaching about how slavery was and what it was. But it was really, really um, an important part of the Western civilization, a very important part of Western civilization, and a huge part of European and American colonization in the East. A huge part of imperialism, a huge part of why everybody speaks English all over the globe, why English is, such a common language. All of this can be traced back to the transatlantic slave trade. Now, the transatlantic slave trade began with the Portuguese, and it began actually and ended with the Portuguese. They were the last to stop enslaving, stop participating in the transatlantic slave trade, but they were also the first. Portugal. And so slavery came to the Americas. It began in the Caribbean and then up through South America. There are way, 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 way more Black people, African people, descendants of African people in Brazil than there will ever be in the United States. And so slavery, you just kept on bringing slaves all through the Caribbean. This is why the Caribbean is Black. When we see commercials about going on cruises and things all through the Caribbean, we'll see like light skinned people with wavy hair. You go to the Caribbean, you see Black people. And this is because of the transatlantic slave trade. And this is also why the dialect is different in the Caribbean than it is in the United States, because African Americans are actually more American than African culturally. In the Caribbean, it's different because they just kept on bringing enslaved people from Africa, kept on bringing them to the Caribbean, and they would just work them until they died out. Also in South America and Brazil, but especially in the Caribbean. So that began in the 1500s, and then we know about the 1619 project comes to the U.S. in the early 1600s, and it took a civil war to end slavery. The peculiar institution of U.S. slavery. Slavery was old when Moses was young. Slavery has, human beings have enslaved each other um, because they could. Europeans enslaved Europeans, Africans enslaved Africans, Asians enslaved Asians. People throughout the Americas, before they were the Americas, practiced slavery of some form. So slavery was old before Moses was young. What is different about US slavery is that it was based on skin color and it was permanent. So you were a slave because you were going to be a slave because you were Black, and Black people were born to be slaves, and this is why you were a slave. So you were never going to not be a slave. And that happened after the early 1600s. Originally, African people who were first brought to, even in Florida and even in, well, in the colonies, were indentured servants like Europeans were. And then after, of course, the early 1600s, because it was so profitable. That is why. And the reason why that Africans were the ones that were, first of all, slavery was already practiced in Africa, and Africans enslaved Africans. And so there was already a system set up. Arabs had enslaved Africans, and then Europeans internationalized it. So Africans were already enslaving Africans, as everyone was enslaving each other. Then Arabs then institutionalized the enslavement of Black people, of African people, and then Europeans internationalized it. Slavery created white billionaires, fueled the Industrial Revolution. I just can't even tell you the wealth. Just imagine the closest thing I tell people was almost like the drug trade, the illegal drug trade. You know how much money is created from that. That is how slavery was, but it was legal. So I say all of that because the US was not going to free enslaved Blacks. Um, Slavery was based on race, and race-based slavery made enslaving Africans throughout the Americas much easier. So African people had no kith or kin like Native American people did. They were first enslaved, and white people, could always run away. Native Americans could run away. African people could not do that, and if they did, then you knew that they were still their skin color made them stand out. They had no kith or kin. They did not speak the language. So culturally, they were isolated. Physically, they looked different. And as has been said, the supply seemed inexhaustible because Africans were enslaving Africans. So the system was already set up. But it was not the kind of slavery that took place in the US. It was, you know, throughout the world. You could marry out of slavery. You could buy your freedom, and not how it was in the US. Like, your skin color did not mean that you were going to, it was not a mark of inferiority. That is not how it was throughout the rest of the world. Only throughout the Americas with the transatlantic slave trade, because it was so profitable and the skin color worked into it. This is how race-based slavery evolved. And from race-based slavery, by the way, we get this narrative of African inferiority that did not exist before the transatlantic slave trade. The Greeks never talked about Black inferiority. The Romans never talked about that. So it did not exist before the transatlantic slave trade. It was used to justify the transatlantic slave trade. And all of this science came out of race-based slavery, measuring people's skulls and things. There's a really interesting documentary series called Race, Power of an Illusion that really, really delves into that. It's a 3-part series from PBS, maybe 10, 15 years old, but it is so interesting. And you really, and also Nell Painter's, I think it's called The Origin of White People, The Myth of Race, but it's talking about the origin of race and where Caucasian and all that comes from. All of this comes from slavery. All of this has its roots in slavery, as far as looking at African people as inferior people and justifying that, and trying to, measure their brain sizes and things like that. So all of this, the slavery was so profitable, the US was not going to free enslaved Blacks. I mean, you had cotton, you had tobacco, and the free labor. So that was not going to happen. And I say that because people will say, well, before the Civil War, slavery was going to end anyway. No, it wasn't. And another really funny mockumentary is called CSA, Confederate States of America. And it is something I also show. It's like a documentary. If the South would have won the war, and slavery was still going on. And so it's kind of interesting and funny. Okay, so that is the peculiar institution of US slavery, and this is why there needed to be a civil war. Resistance began on day one. There is a myth of a docile, happy slave. Blacks were willing to sacrifice their lives for freedom. Black people always, always, always fought for themselves, as human beings do. Human beings fight for themselves. The body will fight to stay alive. If it's drowning, it's going to fight to stay alive. So human beings fight for their own life. a lot of African people who were enslaved from the continent brought over to the Americas, they were warriors on the continent, so places like Angola, West Africa. So these people came and they're, hey, wait a minute. No, I'm fighting back. So a lot of the uprisings, some of the uprisings came from that. So like the Stonewall Rebellion in South Carolina, um, one of the people who led that was an enslaved person from Angola, West Africa, and organized these. And so again, there is a myth of a docile, happy slave, and Black people were happy, and you see this in Gone with the Wind, movies like Gone with the Wind, of the happy darky, and songs sang about it, but that wasn't actually true at all. Okay, so and then there's also this myth of Black people being recipients of freedom. Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves. We'll talk about that. But I want us to understand that Black people always, always fought for Black freedom and still do today. Always, always have. So before Juneteenth, between 1861 and 1865, before the actual June 19th, 1865, um, again, because there was not going to be an end to slavery. Even if the North, or people in the North, wanted to end slavery, it wasn't because of any great love for Black people or thought that Black people should be made equal. Slavery was an embarrassment to a country that is founded on a Bill of Rights, founded on independence, founded on freedom of speech and all these other freedoms. Slavery is an embarrassment. And the South, again, was making big, 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 well, the country was, but slave owners making big, 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 big money. And slavery, of course, is concentrated in the South because of agricultural. And we already know, I hope, that slavery was all up and down the East Coast before the Revolution in the late 1700s. And then certain northern states began to in slavery. But even though they ended slavery, Rhode Island and places like that, they still benefited from the slave trade because they were involved in shipbuilding and things like that. Okay. So the Civil War begins because the South did what they did. And, the South said, no, we're not doing this, and you're not going to tell us what to do. And there are states' rights. And if you think that the Civil War was anything other than keeping slavery. It was not about ending slavery. Remember, the North did not begin the Civil War. The Union did not begin the Civil War. The South began the Civil War to keep slaves. And they said, this is why we're doing this, to keep slaves. And you can go and Google and find and read all kinds of things in their different charters, but they said this. So that's April 1861. There was a Compensated Emancipation Act of Washington, D.C., which was signed and really fought for by a congressman. And that was signed April 16th, 1862. And so that began Emancipation Day. And that applied to Washington, D.C. And the people who were compensated were not the enslaved people. It was the slave owners. Everyone was given $300 per person for that. So you freed your slave and you were given $300 per slave. Okay. So that was that. September 22nd, 1862, Abraham Lincoln had said, listen here, South. Now, I keep telling you, like you would tell a child, okay, now I'm not going to keep talking to you. All right, I'm writing this Emancipation Proclamation. And if you don't stop this foolishness and come on back home, I'm going to do it. I'll show you. I'm going to do it. You're going to see. And so the Emancipation Proclamation was written out September 22nd, 1862, and he put it in his drawer. Abraham Lincoln did, and he signed it, and was going to make it valid January 1st, 1863, giving the South time again to get themselves together. And he said, if I could free all of the, if I could keep slavery and keep the Union together, I would. If I could end slavery and keep the Union together, I would. If I could have some slave and some free and keep the Union together, I would. Whatever I do for the good of the Union. Abraham Lincoln also, after emancipation, after the 13th Amendment, he was a big proponent of deporting Black people to, and this is actually how the country of Liberia, of deporting Black people to back to Africa. And so just so that we don't think that Abraham Lincoln cared about Black people, and just so we understand, you can hate, for example, police brutality and hate what happened to George Floyd and sympathize with that, and not really have a love or respect of Black people. And so that is the thing. We can look at children in cages at the border and think that's terrible, and still say, we don't want those immigrants here, but don't do that to them. But we don't want them here. So that is kind of how Abraham Lincoln was. He wasn't a proponent of slavery. He didn't like slavery at all, but it doesn't mean that he loved and respected Black people. So he signs this Emancipation Proclamation, and he's going to make it valid January 1st, 1863. And in fact, he does make it valid January 1st, 1863. And then 2.5 years after that, June 19th, 1865, invite Union soldiers into Galveston, Texas, to tell them, hey, y'all, did y'all know that there was this thing called the Emancipation Proclamation? If you didn't know, now you know. And so this was a small group, but that is the origin of Juneteenth. Before we get to that, though, Emancipation Day was the first thing to be celebrated because it was Emancipation Day, and that was April 1862. And so it's celebrated in Washington, D.C. It is a legal holiday. I don't know if you can see up here, but the library is closed as a result of it. And it's celebrated in Canada, over here. This is in Trinidad. It's in, again, Washington, D.C. So it is celebrated all over the country, and it is celebrated in parts of the world where there was European colonization that led to slavery. So that's Emancipation Day, April 1816. I'm sorry, April 16th, 1862. That's the origin of Emancipation Day. And Juneteenth is sometimes referred to as Emancipation Day, also referred to as Jubilee Day. So before we get to Juneteenth, the Emancipation Proclamation again was issued September 22nd, 1862, and it is valid January 1, 1863. It applies only to the Confederacy, and it is not valid for border states. Okay, so here are the border states right here. And you have Maryland, Kentucky, West Virginia, and Missouri, because they were not in rebellion. The Emancipation Proclamation did not apply to these. Enslaved people were still enslaved in these states, just so we understand. And then there's also, I believe, some parts of Louisiana as well. So it only applied to the rebellion, to the Confederacy. It only applied to that. So as I said, in rides Union soldiers on June 19th, 1865, 2.5 years after the Emancipation Proclamation is issued, and they ride into Galveston, Texas. Galveston, Texas, right here. And we can see that why Juneteenth is huge. And it is a huge thing. And I just want to show us, if I can pull it up. I can pull it up in Galveston, Texas. Juneteenth is huge in Galveston, Texas. So when on June 19th, 1865, General Granger rode in. He rode in and he read this that I'll show you here. And this is General Order Number 3. And that's what he read. And I just want to show you some of this is here who he is. And so just so that we can see, and you guys can go to, this is Galveston History website. You can go to this website just so that you can see. Doing this right? No, I'm not doing that right. I did that wrong. Okay. All right. So this is General Granger's Order Number 3. And it says that the people of Texas are informed that, in accordance with the proclamation from the Executive of the United States, all slaves are free. This involves an absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves, and the connection heretofore existing between them, becomes that between employer and hired labor. The freedmen are advised to remain at their present home and work for wages. They are informed that they will not be allowed to collect at military posts and that they will not be supported in idleness either there or elsewhere. Because this again, you can see where they talk about will not be supported in idleness because Black people are lazy. So imagine the gall of that. And to say you are to stay on the plantation and now look at your former slave master as your employer and telling the former slave master this. Now you got to pay this person or these people. That's what you have to do. After centuries of these people are inferior, God made them for us to enslave them and all of this. And so this is supposed to be wiped out with this order number 3 or with the Emancipation Proclamation. And of course it was not. But right up here, if you can see, is one of the places where they read the order number 3. And then this is General Granger right here. And this is the order number 3. And as I said, the Emancipation Proclamation did not end slavery. It applied to 11 slave states. It did not apply to the slave states not in rebellion. And it took a 13th Amendment to abolish slavery. And even that was the judicial system. Now we have gone from enslaving Black people to imprisoning Black people. That was actually written into the 13th Amendment. You can't enslave, but you can lock up people and force them to do sort of convict labor. And that is how we got the convict leasing system of the early 1900s and the prison industrial complex today. Locking up Black people, prison is big money, and that is also connected to our judicial system. Our policing and all of that comes from slavery. The slave patrollers were people who ran after and chased after with dogs and all the rest of that, um, runaways. And so what do the police have today? Dogs. So just so that we understand the history of this country, slavery is interwoven in that. And that is why race is so big in our country, because we had race-based slavery. Okay, so we had to use race to justify taking the land from Native Americans, and then we have to use race to justify excluding people like, Chinese people, and it used race in so many different kinds of ways. But slavery was really the foundation of how this all went about. So Juneteenth did not end slavery. The Emancipation Proclamation did not end slavery. Juneteenth did not end slavery. It took the 13th Amendment 6 months after Juneteenth to abolish slavery. However, the end of slavery, African American slavery, was really the beginning of a century or a little more than a century of white American terrorism. When I saw the people storm the Capitol January 6th, those people look a lot to me like these people here. This is the lynching of Will Brown, and I'm on the Will Brown committee, and I actually wrote the marker that's going to be unveiled this Friday at 11:30 outside the Douglas County Courthouse. Um, and so this is Will Brown, September 19th, 19, September 28th, 1919. Will Brown, 40 years old, minding his own business, was accused of raping a white woman and robbing her male friend. Her male friend wasn't robbed and she wasn't raped, and this was all a setup. And it was something that really swept the country for 100 years. But the summer of 1919, that summer is called Red Summer. And then after that, the Tulsa riots, all of that is all about the end of slavery. You can best believe Black people were not getting lynched and set on fire and all of that randomly by an angry white person, because that Black body was worth something. I believe maybe the price of a brand new car. So you wasn't going to do that. You might have some issue with that Black person, but you wasn't going to do what you could do after slavery. And this was really to create fear, because Black people had the vote. It was also to create Black inferiority in the minds of white people who would want to help, and then also to create white supremacy. White supremacy stands on Black inferiority. So there was anti-Black legislation and sundown towns. James Lowen writes in his book Sundown Towns, Lowen, Loewen, and he's also the author of Lies My Teacher Told Me. He writes about, he's got this magnificent book called Sundown Towns, and they're sundown towns mostly in the north. You would think there would be more in the south, but they're mostly in the north because how blacks migrated out of the south, whites migrated out of the south too, and they took their prejudices with them. So you got, you wonder why more black farmers or any black farmers in Nebraska. Nebraska is a farm state. Why are there not black farmers in Nebraska? Black people were not, it's a segregated state, not just Omaha segregated, it's a segregated state. Our country is segregated. So sundown towns really speaks to that. You think about Carter Lake. I live within walking distance of Carter Lake, but black people don't live in Carter Lake. Live around, across the street, up the road, but you don't live in Carter Lake. And so all of that has to do with, really legally, not just the white person that doesn't want black people to live next door, but legally I could do things to you. So there were so many different reasons why black people were lynched, left out, and all of that. And all of this goes back to slavery. The narrative of black inferiority, but mostly white superiority. White people, you are better than black people. So if black people live in your neighborhood is not as good. You definitely don't want black men. That's the other thing, creating a black beast. You definitely don't want black men around black women. They're rapists and they're all kinds of, so all of this foolishness that never took place during slavery, no segregation during slavery, all of this is Jim Crow. And so the end of African American slavery really began 100 years of white American terrorism. And I gave a speech on that at the 100-year commemoration of the Will Brown lynching, September 28th, 2019. Just so that as we sum it up, we understand that Black people have always fought, bled, and died uh, for freedom. Fought, bled, and died to end slavery, then to end Jim Crow, and to secure voting rights and secure the equal access, and that's still a fight today. Black people have to continue to fight for equality under the law. Just simple things. And we have seen in the last year or two, for sure, we have created in this country a narrative of, again, the black beast. Black people are lazy, the welfare queen, and all of this other stuff that really is race based. And it's all a lie. It's all a lie. Okay. So, why celebrate Juneteenth with all of that? Even though Juneteenth did not end slavery, why celebrate it? We celebrate Juneteenth because it is a battle. So we have to look at it like we won a battle, a huge battle. Slavery has ended. And even though, no matter what else is going on today, slavery has ended. And so I tell people that if you look at oppression, you know, or being in prison, if you look at it, something like that, no matter what else is happening, you're out of that situation. Now, what we do from now on is what we have to do, but out of that situation. And so that is a battle that was won. And I want to just show you how Juneteenth is celebrated in some places, and some places it's not. But Black people, I was reading something and they're talking about how Black people, and it's true, have always thought that Lady Liberty stood for us. Like, we have not thought that, but we have connected that with the words on paper. And so we have said, as Martin Luther King said, somewhere I read, and this applies to me too, because I'm a citizen of this country too. So as Black people fight for Black rights, it opens up the door for other people. Voting rights, civil rights legislation, all of that helped everyone. It helped everyone. And so some places around the country, Juneteenth is celebrated at in bigger places than other places. But what's interesting is how it's celebrated, for example, and I want to just show you how it's celebrated in, is this Buffalo? Juneteenth is celebrated in Buffalo, New York. I just think that's so interesting how Buffalo has this long celebration of Juneteenth, and then I know people in Detroit, and they're like, "Oh yeah, well maybe here or there we kind of do something here or there, but not so much." Um, um, and it's like, oh, so you just never know in different parts of the country what has happened is too where people have migrated, and I would think that Buffalo being closer to the Canadian border and the whole Underground Railroad and all of the rest of that, that might be why it's celebrated so hugely in Buffalo. In Omaha, our Juneteenth celebration this year is actually this year going to be on June 19th. I have been a part of adult drill teams since the late 90s and have marched in Juneteenth celebrations since the late 90s. When I was growing up in the 80s, 70s, 60s, I never heard of Juneteenth until I met someone from Texas. I mean, his people were from Texas. And then he was like, "You never heard of Juneteenth?" That was in the late 80s. And then by the late 90s, a lot of Omaha had heard of Juneteenth, and of course, we celebrated here. And so, Omaha Freedom Festival will be June 19th, all day at the Malcolm X building outside. The Malcolm X Foundation is at 3448 Evans Street, and it begins at noon. It goes all day. 12 to 5 is free, and it is kid friendly, and there's bouncy houses and a bike giveaway, and then there's a nighttime concert. So this is the 12 to 5 things. And you could go to Omaha Freedom Festival um, and omahafreedomfestival.com. And this stuff is on the website. Again, this will be at the Malcolm X Foundation building outside. And this is the nighttime event. It is a concert with Juvenile, Michelle Lay, and some other people. It starts at 6:30. Tickets are $25 in advance. And so there is a daytime event, which is free, and a nighttime event, which is not free, but it is all June 19th outside at the Malcolm X building and put on by Freedom Tainment. There's also um, Bo Philberry, who wrote a play about Will Brown during the commemoration of the 100-year commemoration of Will Brown. She wrote that play as well. She is doing the Bonfire series, Buffalo Women, and that will be June 18th through June 26th. And this again is kicking off Juneteenth. So it starts Friday and then it goes for a week. And it is a Black cowgirl musical dramedy um, by both Phil Berry. And she mentions Juneteenth in here as well. Okay, questions?